Of the administration of the oath to the gentlewoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, the whole number of the House is now 434. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of the bill, H.R. 1734, will now resume. The clerk will report the title.
A bill to decrease the deficit by realigning, consolidating, selling, disposing, and improving the efficiency of federal buildings and other civilian real property and for other purposes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maine rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Michaud of Maine moves to recommit the bill H.R. 1734 to the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendments. Page 4, after line 21, insert the following: 10. Properties owned by the Department of Veterans Affairs or other properties used in connection with providing services for veterans, including hospitals, clinics, and facilities that provide job training, post-traumatic stress disorder treatment, housing assistance, homeless services, and rehabilitative care.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes once the House is in order. The House will be in order. Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am hoping today we'll see a rare bipartisan moment here in the House when both sides can come together in support of our veterans. The final amendment I'm offering here today will exempt certain VA facilities from the decommissioning process outlined in the legislation today. It will not kill this bill or even delay its passage. If it's adopted, my amendment will incorporate into the bill, and the bill will be immediately voted upon. I agree with my friends across the aisle that we need to address government waste, especially in this fiscal environment. And I can understand why it makes sense to target the poor management and underutilization of government properties to reduce government waste. But I don't think our desire to address these issues should come at the expense of our veterans. The underlying bill already includes plenty of exemptions to the CIPRA process, namely for bases, camps, or stations under jurisdiction of DOD. It seems to me that if the bill already excludes buildings from consolidation process because our troops rely on them, we should also exclude the buildings for our veterans because they rely on those buildings also. As ranking member of the VA Health Subcommittee, I have heard testimony after testimony from veterans about the difficulties they face in accessing all the VA health services they need.
Gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. The House will be in order. Gentleman may proceed.
The VA already provides health care to approximately 7.8 million veterans. As the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan wind down, more and more of the 2.3 million soldiers from those wars will start to seek care from the Veterans Administration. DOD says that nearly 45,000 veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan have been wounded in action. And even this high number grossly underestimates the number of wounded soldiers who rely on the VA system for health care because of the unseen wounds like PTSD, TBI, etc. We can't consider shutting down VA facilities when the need to help our heroes is increasing. In addition to health care needs, these soldiers will need help finding jobs. The veterans' unemployment rate was more than 15% in January of 2011. It's great news that it fell to 6% over the last year, but at 9% is still above the national average. That is why we have to ensure that the VA's ability to provide career services to returning soldiers isn't undermined. We don't know exactly when, where, or how these veterans will try to access the system, or whether they will be able to access PSD treatment or to find a job, but we should not jeopardize their ability to do so by subjecting the VA to the same consolidation process as other federal agencies. If the bill exempts DoD facilities, it should also exempt VA facilities. Even GAO, whose analysis was used to justify this underlying legislation, cites the unique needs of the VA given the increased demands of our returning troops will put onto the system. As a result of the aging veterans population and a growing number of younger veterans returning from the military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, GAO found, and I quote, "Budgeting for the VA's vital health care mission is inherently complex. It is based on current assumptions and imperfect information, not only about program needs, but also on future economic policy actions that may affect demands and cost of providing these services." End of quote. This means that a one-size-fits-all approach for consolidation of government property does not work for the VA. There are a couple other reasons why the VA should be exempt from this bill. First, the VA has already recognized that it needs to upgrade, modernize, and realign its properties portfolio to provide accessible and cost-effective services. In fact, they have been working on that since 1999. In 2008, GAO said the department has reduced its underutilized space over 4 years by nearly 2/3. Second, GAO found that 66%—
The gentleman will suspend. The House is not in order. The House will be in order. Members are advised to take their conversations off the floor. Gentleman will proceed.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Second, GAO has found that 66% of VA's underutilized and vacant buildings are historic properties or eligible for historic designation and require more effort for disposal. I applaud the other side for looking for ways to cut government spending, and there are clearly improvements to be made in the area of federal properties. But we can't pursue the goal of reducing government spending at the expense of our veterans. In Congress, we frequently mention how grateful we are for our troops, and we often talk about the need to make sure that no veteran is left behind. Well, I'm offering the final amendment on this bill to make sure that we leave no veteran behind. On behalf of our heroes, they deserve our commitment. I urge my colleagues to support the final amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Rise to claim time in opposition.
Is the gentleman opposed to the motion?
Yes.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. First of all, the President's commission in his BRAC includes VA properties. As well, former VA Secretary Anthony Persipi testified in front of our committee that we ought to be looking at all properties, including VA. If we're going to do the best interest of American taxpayers, we've got to address waste in government overall, across the entire nation, across every agency. If there's a property not being used today, then we ought to look at either redeveloping it or selling it off. And this gives us an opportunity to have Republicans and Democrats come together on something that the President included in his jobs bill to actually create American jobs. The old post office right here in Washington, D.C. is a perfect example of waste in government, where we've had a property sitting well over a decade that costs us $6.5 million in upkeep every single year. Now we've got redevelopment happening, where we've got different hotel companies coming in and not only bidding on it, creating 150 new jobs in construction, but an additional 150 jobs in ongoing jobs once the facility is redone, keeping it in its historic fashion and actually being able to utilize it once again. An opportunity to redevelop things that aren't being used today, but also selling off things that have been sitting for decades. Our federal government has a horrible track record of selling properties that aren't being used. In fact, we've sold 82 properties in the last 25 years. We can do much better, and the American taxpayers demand that we do much better. Here's a bipartisan opportunity to get both parties to come together and just sell things that we don't need. If you want to bring in revenue to reduce our debt, here's an opportunity to get rid of the things we don't need, redevelop the things that aren't being used, and get rid of the waste in government. Almost $2 billion we waste every year just in maintaining properties that, again, aren't needed in government. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit, and the question is on the motion to recommit, and those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, the noes have it. The gentleman from Maine.
I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring the recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 8 and Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on the motion to recommit will be followed by 5-minute votes on passage of H.R. 1734, if ordered, and adoption of House Resolution 539. This is a 15-minute vote.
This is the Democratic motion to recommit on a bill that would create a commission to recommend federal properties that could be sold or redeveloped to reduce costs to taxpayers. This one would, this Democratic motion offered by Michael Michaud of Maine would exclude from the bill the properties owned by the Department of Veterans Affairs. Just ahead of this vote, they swore in the newest member to the House of Representatives, Suzanne Bonamici, who won her seat in Oregon in a special election last Tuesday. She becomes the 434th member of the U.S. House. And that means there's just one seat vacant, and that is the seat left by Gabrielle Giffords, who resigned from the House a short while ago. So there are 242 Republicans in the House, 192 Democrats. This is a 15-minute vote. The final passage vote is coming up next. Yesterday in the Senate, they passed the FAA authorization bill, the $63 billion Programs and Policy and Programs bill that the House passed last week. It passes the Senate last night by a vote of 75 to 20, and is now headed to the President's desk for signature. The congressman who shepherded that vote through the U.S. House and through the Transportation Committee, the chairman of the Transportation Committee, John Mica, joined us on this morning's Washington Journal to talk about the legislation.
Congressman John Mica, Republican of Florida, where he represents the 7th District. He's the chairman of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Good morning.
Hey, good to be with you. Bright day, a little chilly in Washington.
That's okay.
I heard some of your preliminary talk about earmarks, and we want to talk about infrastructure this morning, but a lot of exciting territory to cover this morning.
Well, let's just react to that for a moment. The Washington Post has a front-page story that we were talking about, looking at the earmarks that members direct home, and making some correlations between where money is sent home and how members have investments. They own property, and tomorrow the Washington Post is going to be looking at how members of Congress might be helping out family members through bringing home that money to the local region. What do you make of this?
Well, you know, I think, well, someone said that earmarks a little bit like pornography. You know what it is when you see it, but it's, you know, I think legislative earmarks, we've seen some bad ones, and there can also be some good ones. And the alternative, everything Congress does is earmarking, whether we just put one line, you know, we're going to put one line of taxpayer dollars dedicated to billions to whatever. And then you have the alternative of turning that money over to the bureaucrats. And I mean, you can't see out here, but there are dozens of buildings filled with bureaucrats who have never been in these congressional districts that make decisions. And they can make bad decisions, too. So I think the best thing is transparency in the process. I tried, when I became ranking member, to clean up the process. I put all the Republican earmarks online. We had a vetting process. They had to be in on time. You had to sign a disclosure, you know, a conflict disclosure. The nice part about what I'm doing, the FAA bill, now it's hard to believe, and the transportation bill that we marked up in committee last week, we don't have a single earmark. The FAA bill on its way to the President today, and the transportation bill we did in the House, we set an example with no earmarks, believe it or not.
Talk to us about the FAA reauthorization. It passed the Senate last night, something you've been working on.
Seems like part of my life, but, well, the Democrats were unable to pass an FAA bill. I was the chair of the Aviation Subcommittee back in 2001. In 2003, we did a 4-year bill. That 4-year bill expired in 2007. Democrats took over in 2008, and for 4 years, even though they controlled huge majorities, they weren't able to pass a bill. When I took over as chair last year, I passed several extensions, and then I said, whoa, this has to stop. So I sent a rather distasteful extension over. The Democrats had done 17 extensions, and one of my, maybe the 20th extensions, I cut out all ticket subsidies, airline ticket subsidies, in excess of $1,000. Well, that raised havoc in the Senate. They didn't like it, and it caused a partial shutdown of the FAA, you may recall. But what it did is prompt some action, I believe, and that action was completed yesterday. The Senate didn't like, you know, what we were sending them. And we've got some long-term stability to what accounts for about 8 to 11% of our domestic commercial and business activity in the United States. So it's on its way. It's 5 years overdue, and it's very important that we have that stability in place.
You mentioned the debate, really the stalemate that happened over the summer. Congress went on recess in August without coming up with a plan for the FAA, and there was a lot of back and forth. You just now blame the Democrats, but
no, I didn't blame the
Ray
Democrats, but I passed on a Wednesday. They could have finished it by Friday. They didn't like the cutting of the $1,000 plus subsidies. You know, one of the subsidies was $3,720 per airline ticket, and that's outrageous. So they waited 2 weeks to adopt my extension with the cuts in it. But there are two things I was going to do. Is one, move this legislation forward. You know, 4 years of not doing the people's business and going into the 5th year without policy in place, without a blueprint for what accounts for an important part of our economic activity is not you know, it's just not responsible. And we have millions of people out of job, hundreds of thousands in the aviation industry, and Congress is fiddling while their jobs are held hostage. So I did what I had to do, and that legislation is now on its way to the President. I'll do the same thing with the transportation bill if necessary. We need to get the people's business done, stop messing around, and move forward.
Secretary Ray LaHood went on the offensive back in August. He was livid and blamed you as well as other Republicans in the House for what he called
done.
Well, let me.
You know, he had complete control. They had the White House, complete control of the House of Representatives for 4 years. They did nothing, and this is 1 year later. I got it done. I'm pleased with what Republicans did. First thing we did is we kept spending in check. The other thing we did is we cut some of these outrageous subsidies and things of that sort. The other thing we did is next generation air traffic control, which is so important to safety and everything. That's moving forward.
We'll definitely talk about next gen in just a moment. Senator Rockefeller was critical at the time because of cuts to the Essential Air Service program and was also concerned about a multi-year extension from the House that would make it harder for airline and railroad workers to unionize. He said it was about politics. So how did you overcome that impasse?
Well, the House passed one version of changing what, well, the Obama administration had backed a new board in the National Mediation Board, which organizes for labor. They changed 70 years of labor law and said whoever shows up, a majority of whoever shows up, can force everyone to go into a union. The House voted to do away with that. We came up, and John Boehner, I give him great credit. He worked with the Senate leaders and others, and they came up with a compromise that said at least 50% of the members must sign a petition to go to a vote. Then they added some common sense reforms like audits of those elections, like public hearings when the NMB, the National Mediation Board, is doing hearings. So those are some good fundamental compromises that I think will enhance the whole process, both for labor and also for the American public as far as transparency in those elections. So it's a compromise, and I think it's a good one.
We heard a lot of comments on the Senate floor yesterday in support of this FAA reauthorization, but the chairman of the committee that deals with labor issues, Tom Harkin of Iowa, did have concerns about language in the bill on unions. Let's listen to what he had to say yesterday.
So, these few powerful airlines waged an unprecedented attack campaign to kill the rule. First, they found some friends in Congress and tried challenging the rule under the Congressional Review Act. a law that allows Congress to overturn a rule through a resolution of disapproval. They lost that fight here on the Senate floor. Next, they went to court to challenge the legality of the rulemaking. Well, they lost that fight in the district court, and then they appealed it to the Court of Appeals, and they lost there too. So, then they waged a last-ditch effort to kill the rule on this FAA bill, which has nothing to do with it. Again, this was not in the Senate bill. The House put it on. A totally unrelated provision dealing with the National Mediation Board that isn't even a part of the FAA, and which isn't in the jurisdiction of the two relevant committees.
Senator Harkin of Iowa. Congressman Mica, what's your response to that?
Well, the House did pass a different version. You know, the Obama administration changed 70 years of labor rules, and the House had a different opinion. I think the compromise that was reached was a fair compromise, and to delay this process anymore would be not in the best interest of the American people. And I was determined to move it forward. I had, you know, my concern is outrageous cost, duplicate programs, less efficiency, and I think we were able to modify law that I actually helped pass. I helped author in 2003 that expired in 2007 that was long overdue. So we got those reforms, and they had to compromise. Each side did a little bit on the labor issue.
And here's a comment. 18 international unions sent a letter to Congress, and this is how they weighed in with concerns. They said, in the aviation safety and security bill is no place to impose unrelated and controversial labor provisions. Airline and rail workers would suffer significant losses as contracts are jettisoned, collective bargaining rights are cut, and legal hurdles will be placed in the way of gaining a voice at work.
Well, none of that happened, of course, and the Democrat leadership helped work this compromise. So I think it was a fair compromise. We got some transparency in this whole union election process, and that's the way the airlines, many of them are organized. So yes, it does belong in it. Yes, the House voted for probably tougher measures. We didn't get those in the final analysis. So you compromise. But, you know, the American people want us to get this work done and stop messing around. So much of the economy counts on it.
Let's go to Frank here from the phones. He's in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, Democrats line. Hi there.
Hello, Congressman Mica.
Good morning.
Good morning. The last time you were on C-SPAN, the question came up, did you sign the Norquist Pledge? You said no. I looked it up. You did.
Yes, I did, and I apologize for that. When you said Norquist Pledge, I didn't, I went back and looked that up. I did sign the Norquist Pledge. I didn't understand it as being from Mr. Norquist, but I know that I went back and checked the terms, and you're correct, I did, and that's, I guess, a no tax increase pledge.
Norquist Pledge.
Yeah. Apologize if I misunderstood you at the time.
No,
and you
no,
know, someone else asked me a similar question, and I said, is that the same as what I did pledge to do? And you're correct, because I just don't believe we need to increase taxes.
Under any circumstances?
Well, again, I think that there are some cases in which you can look at some loopholes in tax laws that need reform. I'd be open to that. But again, blanket, and if you look at the bills that we're passing, the FAA bill, we don't have tax increases in that. We passed a bill on Friday to fund transportation, and we don't have tax increases in that, nor do I have earmarks. So you try to do your best to stick to those principles, and that's what I've tried to do.
Let's hear from Fairfax, Virginia. Rich, Republican.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
C-SPAN, you guys are wonderful. I'm telling you, I don't know where I would get some of the information I get if I wasn't listening to you. Now, I guess my comment is, you know, this business about these, the $3,700 that they're giving to passengers, or not to the passengers, I guess to the airlines. I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and the airport up there, under Murtha, it grew like you can't believe. Bud Schuster down over the mountain in Altoona did the same thing, and he was the head of the transportation, not the Transportation Administration, but he was in charge of
the committee.
I guess the same thing you're doing, Congressman.
Yeah, right.
I really don't understand the whole idea of these subsidies to anybody. I mean, I own a business. I own a small business. I employ 7 people. We do construction work. Nobody ever asked me to nobody ever gave me a penny, nor do I want a penny. This stuff has got to stop. And I think the whole idea with the internet and social media and all the rest of that, you guys are under the microscope. And I hope, I really hope that somewhere down the line, you'll put a stop to it. Quit calling these things earmarks. They're pork.
Well, I think on the subsidies, we agree. And, you know, I had to do something to get this process moving, and there were some people on the Senate side who had, now this is per airline ticket subsidy in excess of $1,000. That's what I put in the extension I sent over there that caused so much heartburn for them. But, you know, again, we're sent here to represent the American people, and to cut, we've got to, when you've got $17 trillion in indebtedness, you got to start somewhere. And again, I didn't change the world in this, but we did cut some of these subsidies. We kept the funding, again, at a...
Mr. Smith of New Jersey. Mr. Smith of New Jersey votes aye. Mr. Pastor. Mr. Pastor of Arizona votes aye. Mr. Crawford. Off aye, on no for Mr. Crawford.
On this,
Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
He is off aye on no.
Off aye, on no for Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
Okay, it's still closed.
on this vote, the ayes are 186 and the nays are 238. The motion is not adopted. Then the question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. For what
Madam
purpose?
Speaker, on this matter, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Those favoring the recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote.
It's the final passage vote on a bill that would create a commission to recommend federal properties that could be sold or redeveloped to reduce costs to taxpayers. This is a 5-minute vote. Up next, the vote on the rule for the latest in a series of bills that change the federal budget process. The rule would provide an hour of general debate and consideration of 3 amendments. The bill itself would change the way federal loans are calculated. It would also require that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac be included in the federal budget. Again, that rule vote is next.
The yeas are 259 and the nays are 164. The bill is passed. And without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The unfinished business is the vote on adoption of House Resolution 539, on which the yeas and nays were ordered, and the clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Calendar Number 110, House Resolution 539, resolution providing for consideration of the bill H.R. 3581 to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to increase transparency in federal budgeting and for other purposes.
The question is on the adoption of the resolution, and those in favor will signify by saying aye, and those opposed will say no. Members will record their votes by electronic device, and this will be a 5-minute vote.
This is a vote on the rule for a bill that would change the federal budget process. It would provide for an hour of general debate and consideration of 3 amendments. Election news from CQ. They report that Representative Sue Myrick, Representative Republican out of North Carolina, will not seek re-election in 2012. It is primary and caucus day in a number of states, Colorado and Minnesota. Caucusing today. Republicans are caucusing there. Missouri holding its state primary. We'll have Road to the White House coverage for you this evening, with speeches by Mitt Romney in Colorado, Rick Santorum in Missouri, and Ron Paul in Minnesota, and a preview to today's primary and caucuses from this morning's Washington Journal.
James Hammond, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Libby.
Wanted to get your take on these caucuses and the primary. How much impact do they actually have?
They'll have a significant impact. Technically, 0 delegates are at stake today, so it's not really about the delegates, but what it is about is momentum. And today is a critical day for Rick Santorum. It's the most important day for him since the Iowa caucuses, and he's either going to emerge tonight as the superior alternative to Mitt Romney compared to Newt Gingrich, or his campaign is essentially going to be over. He's competing hard in Missouri, where Newt Gingrich isn't on the ballot, and Mitt Romney has not invested time. And if he can't win in Missouri, then he's in real trouble. But if he does win in Missouri, then he's going to be taken very seriously. Likewise, in Minnesota, he's considered the front runner going into the caucuses. If he can win here, conservatives will, especially at the establishment and elite level, will give him a real second look. If he can't win here, his campaign's over. So the stakes couldn't be higher for Rick Santorum.
Politico and other news outlets are reporting that Mitt Romney is directing some of his attacks at Rick Santorum now. He's going at both flanks. He's got to be hitting Newt Gingrich, President Obama, but also now Rick Santorum. So how is this playing out? How is the Santorum presence affecting the other candidates?
Well, Libby, the Romney folks are a little nervous that for weeks they've let Santorum continue to attack them and they've ignored him. So in their internal polling and in public polls, Santorum has the highest favorability in the race. People really like Santorum because they haven't heard all the attacks and the knocks on him. And so yesterday, you saw a flurry of back and forth tit-for-tat press releases between the Romney campaign and the Santorum campaign as each kind of escalated the fight. Meanwhile, because Newt Gingrich is going to have a really bad night tonight, he's expected to do quite poorly in all 3 of the states with contests. He was trying to downplay expectations. And in fact, while these 3 states are voting today, he jets off to Ohio. And so he tried to remove himself from this back and forth between Santorum and Romney to try and let them duke it out and live to fight another day. So that's definitely different than we've seen the last couple of weeks, where it has very much been a Romney-Gingrich race.
Now, if Rick Santorum manages to pull some votes away from Mitt Romney, does it ultimately help Newt Gingrich? There was a story where Newt Gingrich was quoted as saying, hey, any vote against Mitt Romney is sort of good for all of us. Is that the case, or are Santorum and Gingrich still competing for votes together?
They're definitely competing for votes together. They're different. There's sort of this conventional sense that if Santorum was out of the race, those votes would go to Gingrich, and that's not true if you actually drill into the polling. And anecdotally, if you go to Santorum events, a lot of Santorum supporters' second choice is Romney, because they're family values folks, evangelicals who are very uncomfortable with Newt Gingrich, and so they appeal to different bases. What's likely to happen is, say Santorum does really well tonight, a lot of conservatives are going to say, hey, he is the better conservative alternative to Romney, so let's get behind Santorum. You've already seen that in the last couple of days. And then what could happen and this is what the Romney people are hoping for, is that the conservatives who want to stop Romney will continue to be divided more evenly between Santorum and Gingrich. And we're heading into this February lull where we're going to have weeks after Saturday's caucuses in Maine without a contest, nothing until the 28th in Michigan and Arizona. And so conservatives will continue to be divided. They won't be able to coalesce behind one person to stop Romney, and that would allow Romney to coast on Super Tuesday and really accumulate a lot of the delegates he'll need to get the nomination. So the Romney folks would love for conservatives to continue to be divided, and they don't want people to get behind either Gingrich or Santorum. They kind of want to keep both of them alive for a little longer.
Now, James Hohmann, you started off by saying that there's not actually a lot of impact in what happens today. Explain that for us.
Well, technically, these are non-binding caucuses. In Missouri, there's a primary, but it's a popularity contest because it doesn't award any of the delegates to the Republican National Convention, which is where the nominee actually gets chosen. That happens through a caucus process that comes later. So there's no binding impact on the delegates in Missouri. And then in Colorado and Minnesota, no matter what happens in the caucuses, it's essentially a popularity contest. It's a straw poll. The people who actually decide how they're going to vote as delegates are elected in state conventions that don't come for several months. And those people aren't legally or bound by any rules to vote for whoever wins the caucus in the state. So Romney could, in fact, in 2008, Romney handily won the Minnesota caucuses. Here, I'm in Minnesota reporting on the ground today. He won with 50%, but he ended up getting no delegates because he wasn't able to work through the process effectively. Ron Paul got 15% in Minnesota 4 years ago, but he was actually able to get more delegates out of here than almost any other state because his people worked the convention process quite effectively. So the vote itself doesn't actually have an impact on the number of delegates that get awarded. But as we've been discussing, what's key is momentum. Coming out of tonight, Rick Santorum will either look like he's the guy to beat Romney or he's not.
James Hohmann, national political reporter with Politico. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Libby.
On this vote, the ayes are 239 and the nays are 181. The resolution is adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.R. 3581, the Budget and Accounting Transparency Act.
Objection, so ordered. Pursuant to House Resolution 539 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 3581. The Chair appoints the gentlewoman from Michigan, Mrs. Miller, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
Well, that was Chairman.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 3581, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to increase transparency in federal budgeting and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Ryan, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, will each control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Madam Chairman, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Madam Chairman, I want to begin by thanking my colleagues who helped pass the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act and the Baseline Reform Act through the House last week. Today, we are here to continue that work, focused on changing Washington's culture of spending and ensuring policymakers serve as responsible stewards of hard-working American tax dollars. I stand in strong support of the Budget and Accounting Transparency Act, offered by the Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee, Congressman Scott Garrett of New Jersey. While it's well known that Washington has a spending problem, it is less well known that Washington isn't being fully honest about how much it is spending. This bill would increase transparency and accuracy in budgeting for federal credit programs, the housing-related government-sponsored enterprises Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and the publication of budget justification materials. First, it would require fair value accounting, which recognizes the market risk that the government is incurring by issuing a loan or a loan guarantee. For all federal programs that make loan or loan guarantees, market risk is already accounted for in several government programs like TARP and GSEs, and it's a very common practice in the private sector. Second, this bill would bring Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on budget. These enterprises racked up billions in liabilities hidden from the public and from taxpayers. Last June, the CBO testified that it put the total cost of the mortgage commitments made by these two entities at $291 billion, and that cost would ultimately rise even higher. Third, this bill increases transparency for information contained in agency budget requests by requiring that they be made public on the Internet at the same time as they are provided to Congress. Government agencies have an obligation to taxpayers to justify every dollar spent in Washington. Madam Chair, no budget process reform can substitute for political will when it comes to tackling our greatest fiscal and economic challenges. Getting America back on track will require a Senate and a President willing to get serious about the structural drivers of the debt and the continued impediments we have to economic growth. But being honest about the size and scope of our challenges, as this reform calls for, offers us a concrete step in that right direction. At this time, Madam Chair, I would like to yield the remainder of our time for the purposes of managing the bill to the author of this bill, Mr. Garrett, the Vice Chairman of the Budget Committee, and with that, we will reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman will be recognized. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Here we are another day on the floor of the House, another day when we haven't taken up the President's jobs bill that he presented right here before a joint session of Congress last September. We've had some good news in the economy, some numbers that show that we have a fragile recovery going on. It would be a huge mistake not to do everything we can to nurture that recovery. So I hope we will finally take up the President's proposal, and I hope that the ongoing conference committee on the payroll tax cut will complete its work in an expeditious manner. Now, with respect to this particular bill that is before us, it raises some very serious and very complicated issues regarding budget accounting for credit programs. And I want to commend Mr. Garrett from New Jersey. I want to commend him for raising some legitimate issues as part of this conversation, issues that deserve our attention. But it is totally premature to bring this bill to the floor without having more hearings and more review. In the Budget Committee, we've not had a single hearing on the comprehensive question of how we deal with all the credit programs and how to account for them. We had one hearing with respect to whether we apply this to the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, but this bill goes way beyond that and would direct CBO to change its method of accounting for credit programs like student loan programs and for other programs throughout the U.S. Government. It has very far-reaching consequences. This is a matter on which people who have spent their lives looking at the budget disagree, and so the Budget Committee at the very least could spend a few hours on a hearing to understand fully the consequences of doing this. I just want to read from a letter that was sent to us from the former head of the nonpartisan Independent Congressional Budget Office, Robert Reischauer. And he says, "I strongly oppose this change." He goes on to say, "The accounting convention used since the enactment of the Credit Reform Act of 1990 already reflects the risk that borrowers will default on their loans or loan guarantees." He goes on to say, "H.R. 3581 proposes to place an additional budgetary cost on top of the actual cash flows." And he goes on to explain what is a very complicated issue, a very complicated matter. I would say to my colleagues, not that this isn't an appropriate question for the Budget Committee to take up, but it is totally inappropriate for the Congress to direct the CBO to take up a different accounting method, which is just not ready for prime time and for which we have not had the time to really thoroughly review all its consequences. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from New Jersey.
And I thank the Chair, and I, at this point, yield such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
At the start, I would just like to thank Chairman Ryan and the Budget Committee staff for their hard work with regard to H.R. 3581, the Budget and Accountability Transparency Act. Unless you've been living someplace else than here for the last years, you would not be a surprise to you to hear that this country is broke. However, we should not surprise you that the true extent of our country's debt crisis is a lot worse than anybody in Washington is letting on to. How much worse? Well, that's something that people really don't know. And we won't ever know unless we reform the broken budget process here in D.C. As many have talked about before, our budget process is broken. Simply put, we need to put and make the budget process more transparent and accountable. Fortunately, today we are taking a step in the right direction with this bill. The bill before us today, the Budget and Accounting Transparency Act, is, as they say, a common-sense approach to introduce more sunshine and common sense into the budget-making process. So what would the bill do? First of all, specifically, the bill recognizes the budgetary impact of the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, and by bringing them back onto budget and close that black hole that's out there and bring that out of the shadow and into the light. This bill also requires that the federal government apply the very same credit accounting standards as the private sector is doing right now when guaranteeing loans. You know, back in September of '08, as the country was reeling from the fallout of the financial collapse, the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, were placed into conservatorship by the FHFA. Under this agreement, FHFA took control of the two companies, and the Treasury Department risked literally hundreds of billions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, to bail them out. To date, the American taxpayer has sunk over $183 billion and counting into those failed institutions. As if this weren't enough, they've added $1.2 trillion in debt and $5.3 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. Now, because Fannie and Freddie have become the explicit financial responsibility of all of us, the federal government, it only makes sense, don't you think, that we treat them the same way that we would treat any other obligation of the federal government, by formally bringing them onto the budget. The CBO even says this. They took this step several years ago by the Office of Management Budget and resisted the change preferred to obscure the total federal exposure of Fannie and Freddie. It's time that the Obama administration does the same thing. So bringing Fannie and Freddie exposes some of the ugly and maybe we call them inconvenient truths. But I know the American people did not send us here to play a shell game, but did send us here to bring out the facts. You know, the combined debt obligation of Fannie and Freddie isn't the only black cloud hanging over us. There's inaccuracies and lack of transparency in budgeting for federal credit programs across the field. You can talk about the Solyndra situation that makes the news. You know, that fiasco was an example of a loan guarantee gone sour. Federal loan guarantees are contractual obligations between the taxpayer, the private creditor, and the borrower. In that case, it went south. But unfortunately, under current law, when the government loses or issues a loan guarantee, the inherent risk is not reflected in the loan or loan guaranteeing cost. In fact, the CBO estimates that our current federal obligations under these accounting rules today understate the cost of credit program by some $55 billion a year. And because the rules do not account for market risk, that is why we need to change it. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back I reserve the balance of my time only to say that this does those three important things: provide the clarity, the transparency, and the accountability that we are looking for in these and other aspects of the federal government programs.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Maryland.
You ready, Bill? Yeah. All right. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, a member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Pasquale.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the title of this legislation, the Budget and Accounting Transparency Act, maybe they should have stopped there, Madam Speaker, because the rest of the bill is not transparency at all. We still want to deal in the myths. We still want to believe that if we don't pay our bills and if we don't pay the bills that we have the federal government, that everything's going to be all right. The bond rating agencies don't think so, nor does anyone else. So when you put the country in jeopardy of not paying its own bills, here's who you hurt. You hurt the middle class, you hurt the working poor, and you hurt the poor. This is nothing more than a backdoor method, this bill, to politicize and eliminate important federal investments. We've been trying to do that, Madam Speaker, for 4 years. It hurts the middle class, helps working folks, hurts the economy. The use of the fair value accounting is the axe that these extreme methods will take to spending on our education, our small businesses, and the next generation of clean technology. This bill that we are discussing right now requires that certain programs that make loans, whether they be student loans, small business administration loans, or Department of Energy loans for clear energy projects, be scored to cost more than the government actually spends. And you don't even deny it. In short, fair value accounting doesn't call a nickel a nickel, it calls it 10 cents. Artificially inflating spending levels in loan payments and loan programs puts the squeeze on important federal programs that families rely on, particularly in difficult times. And you can laugh all you want, Madam Speaker, but this is the truth. Families are being squeezed out there. And I know that you know, Madam Speaker, that this is important to the daily living of folks that you represent and I represent. And I'm not getting personal. I'm saying what we as representatives are. We got to represent the people in our district, whether they're hurting or not. And I understand that we've had many bills on the floor of this House in the past 3 years to squeeze the economy. And what has it resulted in? You squeeze the states, you squeeze the municipalities. Can I have 1 more minute?
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Thank you.
The gentleman's recognized for 1 more minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You squeeze them so they lay off police officers, they lay off teachers, and they lay off firefighters, and you're telling America, Madam Speaker, that don't worry about it, this will all be over. This is simply, we all got to have shared pain. Yeah, sure, shared. This bill will jeopardize our economic recovery by putting the brakes on the housing market. It would bring us closer to another debt ceiling debate. Madam Speaker, I think that's where we want to head, some of us. Let's have another debate over the debt ceiling. Let's have another debate as to whether we should pay our bills so we can shut down the place. And for you to preside over and get folks to believe that if you shut the government down, maybe that wouldn't be so bad either. Not paying our debts wouldn't be so bad. I don't know what planet we're living on. This country needs pro-growth economic policies. We need to take actions. And the first action we should take